You have no idea who you just humiliated." The words echoed in the glass-walled boardroom, sharp and cold, slicing through the laughter of the people around us. I stood there, stunned, as Mark, the man I had been dating for over a year, shoved me hard in front of his mistress. I could feel the sting not just on my arm, but deep inside me, the embarrassment and anger mixing in a tight knot. And why? Because I refused to play along with his ridiculous little game of showing off his wealth and power? Because I didn't laugh at his jokes or nod at his lies? Mark thought I was weak. He thought I would crumble under pressure, that I'd beg for him to pull me back into his world. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. No idea at all. The woman standing in front of him now was not the girl he had met at that coffee shop 6 months ago. The one who had seemed innocent, naive, easy to control. That version of me had disappeared a long time ago. The woman he had just kicked. That woman had the power to make him regret every single choice he had made today. And he was about to find out just how real that power was. It all started on a Friday evening. Mark had invited me to a private dinner at one of those rooftop restaurants downtown, the kind with glass floors and sweeping city views. I had hesitated. Something about the evening felt off, though I couldn't say what. But I went anyway, partly because I still hoped he wasn't the man I'd discovered he really was. The restaurant was crowded, laughter echoing across the high ceilings. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, carrying bottles of expensive wine. Mark had been charming at first, placing his hand on mine, telling me how much he had missed me. And I almost believed it, almost. Then came the moment I should have left. He whispered something that made my stomach drop. "You know, everyone thinks you're just after my money. Honestly, I don't even know why I'm with you sometimes." I froze. That's when I noticed her. His mistress, smiling smugly from across the table, her eyes sparkling with some secret satisfaction. And then, without warning, Mark shoved me, hard enough that my chair scraped against the marble floor. I stumbled, heart racing, cheeks burning with shame. He laughed, and she laughed, and the world seemed to tilt around me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull him across that table and make him pay right there. But I didn't. I stayed calm, my hands pressed to the table, taking a deep breath. Because unlike him, I knew how to win without losing control. Little did he know, I wasn't just a woman dating a wealthy man. I wasn't someone he could push around, someone who depended on him for anything. No, I owned the very company that was currently negotiating an $800 million deal he had been trying to close for weeks. The same deal he thought would make him untouchable. And the kicker. He had no idea I was in charge. I excused myself under the guise of getting some fresh air. The cool wind hit my face as I stepped onto the terrace, and I let myself finally breathe. My mind raced, planning every move. I wasn't just angry, I was strategic. And Mark had just handed me the leverage I needed. The next morning, I arrived at my office in downtown Chicago, the glass skyscraper gleaming under the early sun. Walking through the lobby, heels clicking against the polished floor, I felt the familiar rush of control, the power that came with owning something significant, something real. My secretary, Jenna, looked up and smiled nervously. She had learned long ago that mornings with me meant business, not small talk. "I need the latest numbers on the Harrison deal," I said, voice steady, calm. "And make sure the presentation is ready. Mark has no idea who he's really dealing with." Jenna nodded, and I headed straight to my office, the city sprawling below me like a living, breathing entity. Sitting at the mahogany desk, I opened my laptop and reviewed the contract details. Every clause, every term, every loophole was mine to exploit if needed. Mark had been arrogant, assuming he could outmaneuver me, assuming he knew my limits. How wrong he was. By mid-morning, I had assembled my top team, lawyers, financial analysts, and business strategists. They looked at me with that mixture of respect and fear I had cultivated over the years. When I walked into a room, everyone knew the stakes. I laid out my plan in simple terms. I would attend the signing dinner tonight, but I wouldn't just observe. I would guide the negotiation from behind the scenes. Every time Mark tried to make a move, I would counter it before he even realized what I had done. Hours passed in a blur of calculations, phone calls, and last-minute strategy adjustments. My team worked quietly, efficiently, preparing for the night that would change everything. By the time I left the office, the city lights were beginning to sparkle like a million tiny stars. I could feel Mark's shadow looming, unaware that I was about to pull the strings that would determine the outcome of his $800 million deal. The restaurant was crowded again when I arrived, the same one where he had humiliated me. I spotted him immediately, laughing with his mistress, confident in his little world. I paused at the entrance, letting the reality sink in. He had no clue who I really was. And soon, the universe would make him remember. I approached the table slowly, deliberately, letting my presence announce itself before I even spoke. The room seemed to still, the chatter fading slightly as people sensed something different. Mark looked up, and his smile faltered. His eyes widened as he registered me, not the woman he thought he had cornered last night, but the one who now held the ultimate leverage. "Am I late?" I asked, my voice calm, controlled. The tension in my tone was unmistakable. Mark cleared his throat, struggling for words. His mistress shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in power. I could see the confusion and fear in his eyes, and I smiled ever so slightly, knowing that the game had already begun. By the time the waiter arrived with the menus, I had already taken control. Every word, every gesture was calculated to remind Mark that nothing was as it seemed. He didn't know the contract I controlled, the millions at stake, or the influence I could wield quietly but decisively. And that realization, when it finally hit him, would be priceless. I excused myself to the restroom again, and this time I allowed myself a small, private smile. The night was far from over, and by the end of it, Mark would understand the truth. Not just about the deal, but about me. About the woman he had underestimated. And as I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I whispered to myself, "You have no idea what's coming next." I stepped back into the dining area, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor, and the entire room seemed to notice. People were talking in hushed tones, stealing glances at me, sensing the shift even if they didn't know why. Mark's mistress gave me a brief, forced smile, but I could see the tension behind her eyes. She had assumed she was untouchable, that her presence was enough to intimidate me. How naive. Mark stood abruptly, knocking his chair back with a loud scrape. I didn't expect you to come tonight," he stammered. His voice was tight, strained. The confidence he had carried yesterday, the arrogance that had allowed him to shove me, was gone. I could almost hear the little voice in his head scrambling, trying to figure out how I had suddenly become untouchable. "I told you, Mark," I said evenly, approaching the table. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." My voice was quiet enough to seem polite, but each word carried weight, controlled and precise. He froze, unsure whether to respond. The waiter arrived, but I waved him off. This wasn't about dinner anymore. This was about power, control, and showing Mark that everything he had assumed about me was wrong. I slid into the seat across from him, deliberately close enough that he could feel my presence, but far enough to remind him I was in command. "So," I began casually, "let's talk about the Harrison deal." His eyes widened. The deal. The $800 million deal he had been gloating about for months. He hadn't realized I had been orchestrating it from behind the scenes, reviewing every clause, every term. Tonight, I held all the cards. "What about it?" he asked, voice shaky. "I think it's time we review the terms," I said, pulling out my tablet and placing it gently on the table. "I've made some adjustments." Mark leaned in, trying to see the screen, but I shifted it subtly, keeping the full view to myself. "Adjustments," he repeated, his voice rising. "You can't. This is my deal. I'm the one negotiating." I leaned back, letting the words sink in. "No, Mark. You're negotiating for yourself. I'm negotiating for the company. And as the owner, I get to decide how this deal happens." His mistress opened her mouth, but I cut her off with a simple look. Silence fell. The tension in the room was electric. Every eye was on us. Mark's face had gone pale. He realized, finally, that the humiliation of last night wasn't a mistake, it was a warning. You can't do that," he said, voice shaking now, almost a whisper. "I've worked so hard on this. And yet you forgot one important detail, I interrupted, calm but deadly. I own the company signing the deal. The one that's going to hand over $800 million to your little empire. If I wanted to, I could walk away tonight and ruin everything you've been building. He swallowed hard. I could see him calculating, panic creeping into his eyes. This wasn't a game anymore. He had underestimated me completely. I leaned forward, voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper, but everyone around us could feel the power behind it. You kicked me yesterday, Mark. In front of her. In front of everyone. You humiliated me. You thought I was weak. That ends now. The waiter cleared his throat awkwardly, stepping back. Mark's mistress looked ready to bolt, and even some of the other diners were exchanging glances, sensing the storm about to hit. I didn't need an audience. I didn't need sympathy. I had power, and I was going to use it. I tapped the tablet, and instantly, Mark's phone lit up with a notification. The screen displayed an email I had sent to his investors, outlining changes to the deal, changes that would protect my company first and could potentially block his participation entirely. He froze, his hand trembling. You really did all of this, he whispered, voice cracking. I did, I said simply. And this is just the beginning. Tonight, you learn the hard way that I'm not someone to be pushed around. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fake fear, not the kind people put on for show. Real, raw fear. And in that moment, I felt the sweet satisfaction of finally standing up, not just to Mark, but to every person who had ever doubted me, mocked me, or thought I was weak. The dinner continued, but the world around us had shifted. I wasn't just the girl he had humiliated. I was the one in control. And by the time the night was over, Mark would understand exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate someone you've wronged. The rest of the night was a blur of controlled movements. I kept my calm, even as Mark fumbled with his phone, trying desperately to undo what I had done. But every step he took, I had already anticipated. Every word he muttered, every glance toward his mistress, played into my plan. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about proving that I was untouchable. By the time dessert arrived, Mark had realized he was completely powerless. His empire, the $800 million he had been bragging about for weeks, rested entirely in my hands. Every investor, every partner, every signature needed my approval. And I wasn't giving it to him, at least, not on his terms. I think we need to call it a night, I said softly, standing up. The subtle power in my tone made the entire table freeze. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but I didn't give him a chance. I didn't even glance at his mistress. I simply walked toward the exit, letting my heels click against the marble floor, echoing through the hushed restaurant. Outside, the night air hit me like a wave. The city lights shimmered across the streets, but I wasn't looking at them. My mind was already racing, planning the next moves. Mark's humiliation was satisfying, yes, but it wasn't enough. I needed to secure my position, to make absolutely certain that no one, not him, not his family, not anyone could threaten what I had built. The next morning, I arrived at my office earlier than usual. The skyscraper towered over the city like a fortress, a reminder of the empire I was shaping. My assistant, Jenna, was already there, a cup of coffee in hand. She handed it to me without a word, understanding perfectly that the morning was mine to command. Did he call? I asked casually. Jenna shook her head. Not yet. But his people have started asking questions. Some of the investors are nervous. Good. That meant the plan was working. The moment Mark realized that I controlled every aspect of the deal, panic would spread, and I would be the only one calm enough to take advantage of it. I spent the next few hours drafting responses, sending carefully worded emails, and coordinating with my legal team. Every action was precise, deliberate, leaving no room for error. I wasn't playing games anymore. I was building an empire, brick by brick, and anyone who had doubted me would have to watch from the sidelines. By midday, my phone rang. It was one of the investors. We need to talk, he said nervously. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Of course, I replied. Come to my office in an hour. When he arrived, I let him speak first, letting him voice the concerns of the others. Every question, every doubt, I answered calmly, firmly, showing control, authority, and absolute confidence. By the time the meeting ended, the investor left reassured, convinced that I was the one steering this ship and that Mark was simply along for the ride. Even then, Mark hadn't contacted me. I knew he was watching, probably pacing his apartment, trying to figure out how he had lost control so completely. But I wasn't worried. I had the advantage, and I knew exactly how to use it. That evening, I attended a board meeting with my top executives. The Harrison deal was the main topic of discussion. I presented the final contract, carefully highlighting the clauses that ensured my company, and I personally had complete authority. There was no room for negotiation, no way for Mark or anyone else to manipulate the outcome. As I closed my presentation, I looked around the room. Every person was watching me, waiting for my next move. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence linger, letting them feel the weight of my control. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from Mark: "We need to meet. Now." I didn't hesitate. I typed back one word: "Fine." This wasn't about apologies. It wasn't about love. It was about showing him, once and for all, that I was no longer the woman he could intimidate. That I was the one with power, influence, and control. That the game had changed, and he was playing by my rules now. When I arrived at his office, I saw him waiting, sitting rigidly behind his desk, the faint flicker of panic in his eyes. He looked like a man trying to piece together a puzzle he couldn't solve. I didn't rush in. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me anxious. I stepped inside, heels echoing in the empty space, and let the silence hang. "You've done a lot," he said finally, voice low. "But this isn't over." I smiled, cold and unyielding. "Oh, Mark. It's over. For you, at least. The deal, the investors, the company, they all answer to me now. You had your chance to treat me with respect, and you blew it. This isn't about money. This is about power. And I've already won." His face turned red with fury. "You think this changes everything?" "It does," I replied calmly. "Because I've been the one controlling it all from the start. You just didn't see it." For the first time, Mark looked small, defeated. And though the confrontation wasn't over, I knew one thing with certainty. I had turned the tables completely. And no one, no matter how arrogant, would ever underestimate me again. I walked into Mark's office with steady steps, the air thick with tension. He stood as I entered, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't the woman he had shoved, laughed at, or humiliated. I was calm, poised, in control. Every breath I took, every movement I made, reminded him silently that the game had changed and I was now the one calling the shots. "You've caused a lot of chaos," he said, voice low, almost pleading. "But you can't just." "Watch closely, Mark," I interrupted, my tone sharp but measured. "Because what I'm about to show you is the difference between someone who reacts and someone who controls." I placed the final contract on his desk, highlighting the clauses I had implemented overnight. Every term protected my company. Every contingency ensured he couldn't influence the deal. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages, realization dawning on him like a hammer hitting his chest. This is impossible," he stammered. "I've worked on this deal for months. I know every number, every clause." "How?" "Because you assumed I was weak," I said, leaning forward slightly, letting my voice fill the room. "You thought I'd bend, that I'd panic, that I'd beg. You were wrong. I've been the one steering this ship the entire time. And now, you get to watch as I finish what you thought you controlled." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched on every line of his face. His pride had been shattered, and he knew it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My power was silent, deadly, undeniable. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "I have contacts, influence. And I have all the proof, the control, and the final say." I cut him off. "Mark, the deal, the investors, the company, they all answer to me. You were reckless, and you assumed too much. I'm here to correct that." For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not the fake kind, not the kind people put on for show. This was the kind that comes when someone finally realizes they are completely outmatched. His mistress had called earlier, furious that he hadn't updated her on the changes I'd made. He had nothing left to manipulate. Nothing left to hide behind. I let the silence linger, letting it press down on him, letting him feel the weight of his miscalculations. Every second was a reminder, he no longer held power. I did. Finally, he sank into his chair, slumping as if the weight of defeat had crushed him. "And what now?" he muttered, voice barely audible. "What now?" I replied, leaning back, "is that I move forward. You can stay in your corner and stew, or you can accept that the world has changed. You thought you could control me, but the truth is, I've been controlling everything all along." I turned and walked to the door, letting him watch me leave. Every step echoed like a victory bell. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly, reflecting the magnitude of what I had achieved. I wasn't just a woman who had been humiliated. I wasn't just someone who had been underestimated. I was the one who dictated terms now, the one who held the real power. By the time I returned to my office, my phone was buzzing non-stop. Investors, executives, and partners all confirming their support. Emails, messages, and calls all aligning with my plan. Everything was falling into place. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Mark had been the storm I needed to test myself, to remind me that control wasn't just about money, it was about presence, strategy, and the courage to act when others underestimated you. As I leaned back in my chair, I couldn't help but think about the future. The empire I was building, the deals I would secure, the legacy I would leave, it wasn't just about winning against Mark. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above humiliation, betrayal, and arrogance. And yet, even with everything under control, a small part of me remained alert. Because I knew Mark wouldn't disappear quietly. I knew his pride would drive him to try again. And when he did, I would be ready. Stronger, smarter, untouchable. Tonight, though, I allowed myself one moment of triumph. I had turned humiliation into power. I had taken control of the deal, the company, and my destiny. And for the first time in a long while, I felt completely, undeniably, alive. The city outside twinkled like a promise, the future wide open before me. And as I stared at it, I whispered to myself, quietly but firmly, this is just the beginning. What are thoughts on this story, and tell us where you are watching from? Leave your comments, like, share and subscribe to our channel.